In January of 2001, Dana White and two casino billionaires named Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta purchased a failing mixed martial arts organization for $2 million. Nobody wanted it. The venues refused to host it. The senator who had helped get it banned from pay-per-view called it a human cockfight. The company had been banned in 36 states and was losing money every month. $2 million was not a bargain. It was a gamble that looked, at the time, more like a reckless bet than a business deal. 25 years later, the UFC signed a 7-year broadcast deal with Paramount, worth $7.7 billion. The company generates $1.4 billion in annual revenue. Dana White is worth an estimated $500 million, and the men and women who actually get in the octagon, the fighters who generate every dollar of that revenue by absorbing punches and kicks and submissions in front of millions of paying customers, receive approximately 17 cents of every dollar that the UFC earns. In the NFL, players are guaranteed 48% of league revenue through their collective bargaining agreement. In the NBA, it is around 50%. In Major League Baseball, it is roughly 54%. The UFC, which is now among the most valuable sports properties on earth, pays its fighters 17% of what it earns off their performances. And because the UFC operates as the only significant employer of elite mixed martial arts fighters in the world, the fighters have no meaningful alternative, no leverage, no union, and for most of their careers, very little legal protection. This is the story of how that happened, why it was allowed to happen, and what it tells us about the structure of power in American sports. Before we get into the mechanics of how this happened, it is worth sitting with those numbers for a moment. $7.7 billion over 7 years is a television deal larger than the contracts that govern most of the established professional sports leagues on earth. $1.4 billion in annual revenue from an organization that did not exist in any recognizable form 25 years ago. And our 17%. That is the share that goes to the people without whom the product does not exist at all. Not the people who market it, not the people who broadcast it, not the private equity firms that own it, not the talent agencies that manage it. 17% goes to the athletes who get in a cage and hit each other. To understand where the UFC is today, you need to understand where it started, because the conditions of its founding created the conditions of its exploitation, and Dana White understood that from the beginning. The Ultimate Fighting Championship debuted in 1993 as a tournament designed to answer a question that had animated martial arts gyms and bar fights and backyard arguments for decades. Which fighting style is actually the best? The event was presented as a cross-disciplinary competition, a sumo wrestler against a boxer, a kickboxer against a judo practitioner. No weight classes, no judges, no time limits, as few rules as possible. The first champion weighed 180 pounds and defeated opponents who outweighed him by 60 or 80 pounds, using a fighting system called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that most Americans had never heard of. The early UFC was simultaneously fascinating and genuinely disturbing. It was compelling because it was answering a real question in the most direct way possible. It was disturbing because the answer sometimes looked like a large man sitting on top of a smaller man and punching him in the face until the referee intervened or someone tapped out. Senator John McCain, who was among the most powerful politicians in Washington at the time, watched a videotape of an early UFC event and described it as human cockfighting. He then used his position on the Senate Commerce Committee to pressure state athletic commissions and cable companies to ban the events. By the late 1990s, the UFC had been shut out of major cable television, was banned in most states, could not find venues willing to host it, and was losing money at a pace that made its future uncertain. This was the company that Dana White saw an opportunity in. White was, in 2001, a 20-something boxing manager in Las Vegas who had grown up in Boston and worked his way into the orbit of the Fertitta brothers through the informal social networks that connect people in the entertainment and casino industries. Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta were casino billionaires, heirs to a gaming empire that had grown into one of the largest casino companies in the country. They were not looking for a sports investment, but White pitched them on the UFC with an argument that was, in retrospect, the entire business model in embryonic form. The MMA market was unregulated. No government body had established the kind of oversight structure that governed boxing. There were no sanctioning organizations with authority over rankings and titles. There were no protections for fighters analogous to the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act that had been passed the previous year. A single promoter, if they moved quickly enough and strategically enough, could do something that was impossible in boxing. They could establish exclusive contracts with all the significant fighters, control the rankings, control the titles, and create a single employer for an entire professional sport. The UFC, in other words, could be a monopoly by design. White and the Fertittas bought the UFC for $2 million in 2001. The first strategic priority was legitimacy. The second was lock-in. On legitimacy, the new owners began lobbying state athletic commissions to establish regulatory frameworks for mixed martial arts. This sounds counterintuitive because regulation typically constrains business, but in this case, the Fertittas understood something important. If the states regulated MMA, the UFC would become a legitimate sport rather than a fringe spectacle. Legitimate sports attracted television deals, corporate sponsors, and mainstream audiences, and because the UFC would be at the table helping to write the regulatory framework, they could ensure that the regulation covered safety and structure without touching the economic terms that mattered most to them, the contract exclusivity and the monopoly control. On lock-in, the UFC began signing fighters to exclusive multi-year contracts, not exclusive for a fight or a card, but exclusively for years, sometimes for the entire active period of a career. A fighter under UFC contract could not compete for any other organization. They could not fight in Japan, in Europe, in any competing American promotion. Their value as a professional athlete existed only inside the system that the UFC controlled. If they refused to sign, they were locked out of the highest level of competition in their sport, which meant they were locked out of the exposure that would make their careers commercially viable. The consolidation strategy operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The UFC used its financial resources, backstopped by the Fertitta casino empire, to outbid competing promotions for emerging talent. It targeted the best fighters in smaller organizations with contracts that those organizations could not match. In markets where competition was emerging, such as Japan and Europe, it acquired competing organizations outright rather than allowing them to develop into genuine rivals. The World Extreme Cage Fighting Organization, which had developed a loyal following in lighter weight classes, was absorbed in 2006. Strikeforce, which had assembled a strong roster and was beginning to attract mainstream attention, was purchased in 2011 and eventually shut down, with its fighters absorbed into the UFC on UFC terms. The Japanese Pride organization, which ran events in massive stadiums and paid some of its fighters more than the UFC was paying comparable athletes, was acquired in 2007 and systematically dismantled. Each acquisition was presented as expansion, as bringing more fights and more fighters to audiences that wanted them. What each acquisition actually accomplished was the elimination of a competing labor market. Every organization the UFC absorbed was another organization that could no longer offer fighters an alternative employer and therefore an alternative negotiating position. By 2010, the structure was essentially complete. There was no meaningful place for a professional mixed martial artist to compete at the highest level of the sport other than inside the UFC's system. The timing of this strategy was everything. In 2001, MMA was still marginal enough that fighters were grateful for the opportunity to compete at all. The contracts they signed without much negotiation, often without legal representation, bound them in ways they did not fully understand until later. By the time the UFC became the dominant force in combat sports, the contracts were already signed, the exclusivity was already established, and the leverage had already shifted permanently in the promoter's favor. But the Fertittas still had a problem in 2004. They had spent $44 million building the company since the acquisition, and it was still not profitable. They had legitimacy, they had a roster, they had a structure, but they did not have an audience large enough to sustain the business. What they needed was a hit. Dana White came up with one. The idea was to turn the process of becoming a UFC fighter into a reality television show. The Ultimate Fighter would take a group of aspiring mixed martial artists, house them together in a Las Vegas compound, film their lives and their training and their conflicts, and then pit them against each other in elimination rounds that would end with a UFC contract for the winner. Spike TV, which was looking for programming that skewed toward young men, agreed to air the show. The deal was remarkable in its terms. The UFC essentially paid for the production and gave the episodes to the network for free, because what they were buying was not a broadcast fee, but an audience. The first season of The Ultimate Fighter aired in 2005 and ended with a live finale that drew enough viewers to justify a second season. The second season drew more. By the time the show had run several seasons, it had introduced mixed martial arts to a generation of American men who became the core of the UFC's paying audience. The reality show model also served an important structural function. It gave the UFC a pipeline for identifying and developing talent, and it gave fighters an audition that felt like an opportunity, but came at the cost of appearing under UFC contract from the moment they were cast. For a fighter like Cajun Johnson, a lightweight from British Columbia who competed professionally for years before landing a spot on The Ultimate Fighter, the show represented the culmination of a decade of sacrifice. Training costs in mixed martial arts are not covered by any employer. A fighter pays for gym membership, coaching fees, nutrition, equipment, travel, and medical expenses out of whatever they earn. Johnson spent years earning small amounts from small promotions while dreaming of the UFC contract that would change everything. When he got the call, it felt like the dream had arrived. Finally, he thought, he would not have to worry about paying rent. What the contract actually said was different from what he had imagined. The UFC's standard fighter contract at that time was structured around a show fee, the amount paid simply for appearing, and a win bonus, an equal additional amount paid only if the fighter won. Johnson's contract paid $8,000 to show and $8,000 to win. For a fighter competing once a year, that was $16,000 before expenses. The training costs for a competitive mixed martial artist at a professional facility, including gym fees, coaching, travel to training camps, nutrition, and gear, could easily run $40,000 to $60,000 annually. The math did not work. It had never been designed to work. The contracts also contained provisions that fighters in other professional sports would find extraordinary. A UFC contract extended automatically if a fighter was injured and unable to compete, meaning the clock stopped whenever the fighter was not earning. The period of inactivity did not reduce the length of the contract obligation. If a fighter blew out a knee during training, the UFC could pause their contract while the fighter healed, recovered, and returned to competition, then resume the clock. In a sport where injuries are not occasional but structural features of the profession, this provision meant that fighters could spend years bound to a contract without the contract's duration meaningfully advancing. The injury question revealed the deepest structural problem with the UFC's classification of fighters as independent contractors. In virtually every other context, an athlete who competes exclusively for one organization at the highest level of their sport would be classified as an employee. They would receive health insurance, workers' compensation, retirement contributions, and the right to organize collectively. UFC fighters are classified as independent contractors. The UFC provides insurance for injuries sustained during actual fights, but coverage during training, which is where most serious injuries in combat sports occur, is either limited or absent. Fighters who train 8 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for a single employer that controls their career, their ranking, their title opportunities, and their commercial appearance rights, are classified for legal purposes, the same way a freelance web designer is classified. The UFC's use of the independent contractor classification to avoid standard employer obligations is not unique to combat sports, but its application in this context has a particular irony. The independent contractor classification makes sense for someone who genuinely works independently, who sets their own hours, works for multiple clients, and retains the freedom to accept or decline work based on their judgment. UFC fighters do not work for multiple employers. Their contracts prohibit that explicitly. They cannot set their own schedules. They cannot determine when they compete or how frequently. They cannot choose their opponents. They cannot negotiate their own equipment or appearance terms. They are, in every functional sense, employees of a single employer who retains comprehensive control over their professional lives. The classification as independent contractors is a legal fiction that exists not because it accurately describes the relationship, but because it benefits one party to the relationship enormously and costs that party nothing politically. The fighters understood this at some level, but they also understood something else. Complaining about it publicly was not safe. The UFC's power over a fighter's career extended well beyond the terms of any single contract. The organization controlled the rankings that determined who received title opportunities. It controlled the matchmaking that determined which fights happened and when. A fighter who publicly criticized the UFC's pay structure, its contract terms, or its treatment of athletes could find themselves quietly disfavored in the matchmaking process, passed over for main event slots that would have increased their visibility and their earning power, scheduled against opponents who were stylistically unfavorable, or simply not offered fight opportunities None of this needed to be stated explicitly. The power differential was understood, and fighters understood the cost of speaking up. Some spoke anyway. In 2015, the UFC formalized a new revenue structure that made the pay problem significantly worse. The organization signed an exclusive 7-year apparel deal with Reebok worth $70 million. Under the terms of this deal, fighters competing in UFC events would wear Reebok gear and could not wear gear from any other sponsor or display logos from any personal sponsorship during fights or promotional activities. Before the Reebok deal, personal sponsorships had been the primary mechanism through which fighters supplemented the often inadequate purses they received from the UFC. A fighter who was visible and marketable could earn sponsorship income from supplement companies, gambling sites, apparel brands, and countless other businesses that wanted access to the UFC's audience. The better the fighter, the more the sponsorships were worth. For many fighters competing at the middle and lower tiers of the UFC roster, sponsorship income was not supplementary. It was the difference between covering training expenses and not covering them. The UFC claimed that the Reebok deal would distribute money directly to fighters based on a tier system linked to their experience and ranking. In practice, the tiered payments covered a fraction of what fighters had previously earned from independent sponsorships. A fighter who had been earning $50,000 annually from personal sponsors might receive $8,000 annually from the Reebok tier system. The UFC had taken the financial relationship between its fighters and the commercial market that was paying to see those fighters compete and inserted itself as the exclusive intermediary, collecting the money and redistributing a portion of it according to terms it set unilaterally. By 2020, the broad outlines of what the UFC had built were visible enough that a group of former fighters decided to challenge it legally. The antitrust lawsuit filed in 2014 on behalf of former UFC fighters alleged that the organization had engaged in illegal monopolization of the mixed martial arts market by suppressing fighter wages through a combination of exclusive contracts, the systematic acquisition or destruction of competing promotions, and control over the rankings and titles that determined fighter value. The lawsuit assembled detailed economic evidence showing that fighters as a class received a dramatically lower share of revenue than athletes in comparable professional sports, and argued that this was not the result of market conditions, but of deliberate anti-competitive conduct. The UFC fought the lawsuit at every stage for a decade. It challenged class certification. It disputed the economic methodology. It argued that the MMA market was defined too broadly or too narrowly, depending on which framing was most advantageous at each stage of the proceedings. It retained expensive lawyers and economic consultants and deployed the full resources of a billion-dollar organization against the legal claims of professional athletes, most of whom were not wealthy. In 2024, the UFC agreed to settle the lawsuit for $375 million. This sounds like accountability until you read the terms. The UFC did not admit any wrongdoing. The settlement was spread across a large class of fighters, meaning individual payouts were modest after legal fees. The structural practices that the lawsuit had challenged, the exclusive contracts, the control over rankings and titles, the classification of fighters as independent contractors, remained entirely unchanged. $375 million was, for the UFC, a cost of doing business. In 2025, a second class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of fighters who had competed after 2017, suggesting that the lesson had not been learned in any meaningful operational sense. The fighter who became the clearest symbol of the structural problem was Francis Ngannou. Ngannou grew up in Cameroon and came to Europe as an undocumented migrant, living on the streets of Paris for a period before making his way into boxing and then mixed martial arts. His story was the kind of story that sports mythologizes: the extraordinary physical gifts, the unimaginable hardship, the dedication, the rise to the top of the hardest sport in the world. By 2022, Ngannou was the UFC heavyweight champion, one of the most recognizable faces in combat sports, a man who could generate massive pay-per-view sales and fill arenas. When his contract expired, Ngannou made a series of requests that in any other professional sports context would have been considered completely unreasonable to deny. He asked for health insurance for himself and his training team. He asked that all UFC fighters be permitted to have personal sponsors. He asked for an independent legal representative present during contract negotiations so that fighters would have someone advising them who was not employed by the organization they were negotiating against. Dana White's public response was that Ngannou was talking nonsense and that he was not losing any sleep over the situation. Ngannou left the UFC. He went to a Saudi-backed boxing promotion, fought the heavyweight boxing champion, and performed well enough in a sport he had not trained primarily for to demonstrate that his market value had not been a product of UFC marketing but of his own extraordinary ability. The UFC replaced him with a new champion. The press coverage of Ngannou's demands was remarkable for how few outlets noted that asking for health insurance and an independent lawyer during contract negotiations represents the absolute floor of worker protection in any comparable industry. While the fighter compensation problem was the internal face of what the UFC had built, the external face was the ticket pricing. In the early 2000s, attending a UFC event was an accessible experience for a dedicated sports fan. The prices were comparable to attending a Major League Baseball game. By 2026, the last row of a mid-tier arena for a UFC main event could cost $500. Floor seats at a premium event could cost several $1,000s. The total cost of attending a UFC pay-per-view weekend, including travel, hotel, and tickets, had become a financial undertaking comparable to attending the Super Bowl, a comparison that would have seemed absurd in 2005. The UFC's official explanation was demand. The sport had grown enormously in popularity, and the market had set prices at the level where the seats still sold. This explanation was not wrong as a description of market mechanics, but it omitted a critical variable. When there is no competition, there is no price discipline. A fan who wants to attend a live elite mixed martial arts event has exactly one option. There is no competing league. There is no alternative organization where the same fighters compete for lower ticket prices. The UFC had, over 25 years, systematically acquired or driven out every organization that might have offered competition, and the result was the ability to charge whatever the market would bear with no ceiling imposed by alternative options. The history of that consolidation is worth understanding. In the mid-2000s, the most significant competition to the UFC came from a Japanese organization called Pride FC. which ran events in venues like the Tokyo Dome with production values and fighter payouts that in some respects exceeded what the UFC offered. In 2007, the UFC purchased Pride. The organization was subsequently shut down. Its fighters were absorbed into the UFC on UFC terms. Its institutional independence as a competitive marketplace for mixed martial arts talent was eliminated. Other organizations attempted to fill the gap. Each was either acquired, undercut through exclusive contracting that drained their talent pool, or simply outspent into irrelevance by an organization backed by casino money and, after 2016, by private equity money when the UFC was sold to a group including the talent agency WME for $4 billion, a value that reflected exactly what the monopoly structure was worth. The physical cost that fighters absorb in exchange for these financial terms deserves specific attention, because the gap between what fighters risk and what they receive is not just economic, but biological. Mixed martial arts is among the most physically demanding professional sports in existence. The training required to compete at the UFC level involves years of high-intensity contact that produces cumulative neurological damage that shows up not in a single catastrophic event, but in a gradual erosion of cognitive function that may not become apparent until a fighter is in their 40s or 50s. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the progressive brain disease associated with repeated head trauma, has been found in the brains of deceased combat sports athletes at rates that suggest widespread prevalence among those who compete professionally for extended periods. Shane Carwin, a former UFC heavyweight title contender who submitted a declaration in the antitrust lawsuit, described in his deposition how the CTE he had developed left him bedridden for days at a time, unable to maintain employment despite holding a degree in mechanical engineering. He had been a major UFC draw. His fights had generated significant pay-per-view revenue. The organization that had profited from his performances contributed nothing to his medical care after his career ended, because he was an independent contractor, and independent contractors receive no such thing. The neurological damage in combat sports is not randomly distributed across the roster. It is concentrated among the fighters who compete most frequently, who take the most damage, who accept the lowest-paying fights because they need the income and cannot afford to be selective. The fighters who accumulate the most brain damage are often the fighters at the lower end of the pay scale, the $8,000 to show fighters who are taking fights constantly to cover their training costs, not the main event stars whose income allows them to be patient about when and how often they compete. The private equity acquisition brought a new dimension to the story. When WME, which became Endeavor, purchased the UFC, it introduced the return expectations of institutional investors into the management calculus. Private equity does not buy sports properties to be stewards of athletic competition. It buys them to extract returns that justify the capital invested. The easiest way to increase returns in a business that controls a monopoly is to reduce the share of revenue that goes to the people who generate the product. Fighter pay as a percentage of UFC revenue did not increase after the Endeavor acquisition. It decreased. By the middle of the 2020s, Dana White had begun looking at boxing with the same eyes he had used to look at mixed martial arts in 2001. Boxing, unlike MMA, was heavily regulated. The Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act, passed in 2000, had established specific protections for professional boxers. Promoters were required to disclose the financial terms of their agreements with fighters. Promoters were prohibited from also acting as managers, which prevented the conflicts of interest that had allowed figures like Don King to simultaneously represent fighters and promote the events in which those fighters competed, effectively negotiating with themselves. Contracts that bound fighters for extended periods through multi-fight options were restricted. Sanctioning organizations were kept independent of promoters, meaning no single organization could control both the rankings that determined title shots and the contracts that bound the fighters competing for those rankings. The result was imperfect, but meaningfully different from MMA. A professional boxer competing at the highest levels had the ability to play promoters against each other. If Top Rank and Matchroom were both interested in signing a particular fighter, that fighter could negotiate from a position of competition. The multiple sanctioning bodies, while sometimes criticized for creating too many champions and too much confusion, also prevented any single organization from controlling the supply of championship-level competition. White launched Zuffa Boxing in 2024, a promotion that would apply the UFC model to professional boxing. His backers included Turki Al-Sheikh, the Saudi Arabian official who had become one of the most significant figures in global sports investment through the public investment fund's sports acquisitions, and Ari Emanuel, the Hollywood talent agency CEO, who controlled Endeavor, and therefore the UFC. The backing was significant. Saudi money had become the defining force in elite sports acquisition, from the Live Golf Tour to the purchase of Premier League clubs to massive boxing events staged in Riyadh. The problem for White was that boxing had legal protections that prevented him from operating as he had operated in MMA. He could not sign fighters to the kind of exclusive long-term contracts that had allowed him to control the UFC's talent pool. He could not control the sanctioning bodies that awarded championship recognition. The Muhammad Ali Act, specifically designed to prevent the kind of promoter dominance that had historically exploited boxers, stood directly in his path. So he set out to change the law. The Muhammad Ali American Boxing Revival Act was introduced in Congress with bipartisan support. On its surface, it sounded like protective legislation. It included provisions for a minimum wage for professional boxers, enhanced health coverage, and improved safety measures. It retained the name of the most celebrated boxer in American history. Congressional supporters described it as a modernization of boxing regulation, an effort to revitalize a sport that had lost market share to MMA over 2 decades. What the legislation also included, in the legislative language that most people who heard about the bill would never read, was a provision allowing for the creation of unified boxing organizations that could award their own rankings, their own championship titles, and, crucially, sign fighters to exclusive long-term contracts. This was not a reform of the Ali Act. It was a partial repeal of its most important provisions, disguised as reform, backed by the exact interests that stood to benefit from the repeal. The Saudi connection to this legislation is worth examining separately because it represents a convergence of interests that extends well beyond a single piece of sports law. Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund has, in the past several years, spent enormous sums acquiring presence in global elite sports, golf through the Live Tour, soccer through the purchase of clubs, and the staging of prestige tournaments, boxing through massive events staged in Riyadh that have attracted some of the sport's biggest names. The strategy is understood by sports economists and foreign policy analysts as sports washing, the use of major sporting events and team ownership to build positive associations with the Saudi government and its leadership in countries where that leadership's human rights record would otherwise generate sustained criticism. For White and Emanuel, the Saudi partnership offered access to capital that could establish the Zuffa boxing venture as a serious global force quickly. For the Saudis, the partnership offered access to the most significant combat sports market in the world, run by the people who had proven most capable of extracting value from it. The convergence of a domestic American monopoly project with a foreign sovereign wealth fund's global sports acquisition strategy was not accidental. It was a deliberate alignment of complementary interests backed by complementary power. Critics of the legislation included current boxing promoters, fighter advocates, and the family of Muhammad Ali himself, who issued statements objecting to the use of his name for legislation they believed would undermine the protections he had advocated for. They argued that the bill would allow a single organization, one that happened to be backed by the largest talent agency in Hollywood, one of the richest sovereign wealth funds, and the man who had built and operated the most successful combat sports monopoly in history, to replicate that monopoly in boxing. The argument was not complicated. Give us the legal authority to sign exclusive contracts and control rankings, and we will do to boxing what we did to MMA. The legislative packaging made the power grab harder to see, but the structure was identical. Running through the entire UFC story is a political relationship that deserves its own examination. Dana White and Donald Trump have been publicly close for 25 years, a relationship that began when Trump offered the Trump Taj Mahal in Atlantic City as a venue for one of the UFC's first events after the Fertitta acquisition. The alliance has been mutually beneficial. Trump got association with a growing and culturally significant sports property. White got a powerful political ally with the inclination and the connections to help when needed. White delivered a prominent speech at the 2016 Republican National Convention. He appeared again at the 2020 convention. When Trump won a second term in 2024, White was one of the most visible non-family figures at the victory celebration. The friendship was not merely social. The UFC operates in a regulatory environment. Its fighter classification practices have attracted scrutiny from labor law experts. Its antitrust practices were the subject of a decade-long lawsuit. Its ambitions in boxing require legislation. Political relationships of the kind White has cultivated with Trump and with the constellation of Republican donors and officials who move through the UFC's orbit are not incidental to the business. They are part of the business. The plan to hold a UFC title fight at the White House, which White announced in early 2026, was not purely a sporting event. It was a demonstration of the relationship between an organization seeking regulatory accommodation and the political figure best positioned to provide it. The invitation was not available to ordinary fans. It was described as being for Trump donors and technology industry figures, the specific economic constituency whose interests overlap with the UFC's on questions of worker classification, antitrust enforcement, and labor regulation. When the most powerful man in the country is also the man who lets you throw a party on his lawn, you do not need to call your lawyers about whether the next regulatory challenge will be handled favorably. You already know. What makes the UFC story significant beyond combat sports is what it illustrates about the relationship between monopoly, labor, and political power in the contemporary American economy. The UFC did not achieve its current position through superior entertainment or superior athletic competition alone. It achieved it through a deliberate and successful campaign to establish exclusive contractual control over the labor supply of an entire industry before that industry was large enough to attract the regulatory scrutiny that would have constrained such control. By the time the UFC was big enough to draw congressional attention, it was also big enough to fund the lobbying and legal defense needed to resist regulatory intervention. By the time fighters were numerous enough and organized enough to challenge the system in court, the system had already generated hundreds of millions of dollars for its owners, and the settlement of the legal challenge cost less than a single year of the profits that the challenged practices had generated. The antitrust lawsuit also produced something beyond the settlement itself, a documentary record of the UFC's internal practices that would not otherwise be publicly available. Depositions taken during the discovery process revealed the internal logic of the UFC's strategy in ways that the organization's public communications carefully avoided. Dana White's own deposition described the explicit intention to control fighter careers as a mechanism for controlling the market. Email chains from UFC executives discussed how to respond to fighter requests for higher pay in ways that made clear those requests were being evaluated not on their merits, but on the organization's leverage to deny them. The documentation assembled by the plaintiff's attorneys told a story that the UFC's public image, carefully cultivated through years of marketing the organization as the transformative force that built a sport from nothing, was designed to obscure. The antitrust settlement is worth dwelling on for a moment. $375 million is a large number in absolute terms. In context, it represents approximately 2.5 months of UFC revenue at current levels. The organization paid 2.5 months of revenue to settle a decade-long lawsuit alleging that it had illegally suppressed fighter wages across a much longer period. The people who had authorized and maintained the practices that the lawsuit challenged received no meaningful personal consequence. The practices themselves remained unchanged. The next generation of fighters signed the same kinds of contracts under the same structural conditions. This is a pattern that repeats across the American economy. The worker classification that defines UFC fighters as independent contractors rather than employees is the same classification that Uber and Lyft use for drivers, that Amazon uses for delivery workers, that dozens of technology companies use for the gig workers who form the operational backbone of their services. The classification allows organizations to deny benefits, prevent collective bargaining, and externalize the costs of work onto the workers themselves. In each case, the classification is defended on the grounds that workers have freedom and flexibility, and in each case, the reality for workers who depend on a single dominant platform for their livelihood is that the freedom is theoretical and the extraction is concrete. The monopoly structure that the UFC built in combat sports mirrors the monopoly structures that Amazon has built in retail logistics, that Google has built in search advertising, that Meta has built in social connection. In each case, the monopoly was established before regulators understood what was being built, defended with arguments about market definition and consumer benefit, and maintained with the political and legal resources that the monopoly's profits had generated. In each case, the workers who make the product receive a declining share of the value they create, and the owners of the platform receive an increasing one. The fan who pays $500 for a seat in the back row of a UFC arena, the fighter who takes a head kick for $16,000 and no health insurance, the mixed martial artist who trains a decade for the right to sign a contract they cannot negotiate and cannot leave, are all participants in the same structure. They are the inputs. The outputs go elsewhere. Dana White did not invent this structure. He adapted it from the entertainment industry he grew up adjacent to. The talent agency model, the studio system, the mechanisms through which powerful intermediaries position themselves between creative producers and the audience that pays for what those producers create and extract rent from both sides. What he built in MMA was an extension of a very old logic into a new market, with the specific innovation of achieving it before any protective regulatory framework existed to prevent it. There are people who argue that the UFC's fighter pay structure reflects fair market conditions, that fighters know what they are signing and agree to the terms voluntarily, and that the organization has created enormous value that did not previously exist. These arguments have some merit as descriptions of mechanics. The contracts are signed voluntarily, in the narrow legal sense that no one is holding a gun to anyone's head. The UFC did create a sports property where none existed. Dana White and the Fertittas took genuine risks with their own money in the early years, when it was not obvious that the UFC would become what it became. But voluntary signature is not the same as fair negotiation. When one party to a contract is a young fighter who has spent a decade training for this moment, who has no savings, who has no leverage, who has no alternative employer operating at a comparable level, who has no union and no collective bargaining, and who is sitting across from a representative of the only significant employer in their sport, the voluntariness of the signature is qualified in ways that the law has historically recognized as significant enough to warrant protection. Labor law was invented precisely because the voluntariness of individual employment agreements, when one party holds all the structural power and the other holds none, is not sufficient to produce fair outcomes. The specific number, 17%, is more revealing than any individual contract term. The NFL pays 48% to players. The NBA pays 50%. The NHL pays around 50%. Major League Baseball pays more than 50%. These are not the result of benevolent owners deciding to share generously. They are the result of decades of labor organizing, collective bargaining, strikes, and the gradual accumulation of legal and institutional protections that gave players enough power to negotiate for a larger share. UFC fighters have none of those things. They have no union. They have no collective bargaining agreement. They have individual lawyers negotiating individual contracts against a counterparty that employs full-time negotiators who do this every day and whose entire institutional incentive is to minimize the share of revenue that goes out to labor. The men who get in the octagon absorb the physical punishment. They endure the training camps, the weight cuts, the brain injuries, the broken hands, the dislocated shoulders, the years of physical wear that leave most fighters with permanent damage by their mid-30s. They do this in exchange for contracts they did not negotiate from a position of strength, for pay that represents 17% of the revenue their performances generate, for a career that can be frozen in place by an injury while their contractual obligations continue unchanged. The person who bought the company for $2 million is worth $500 million today. The people whose bodies made the company worth that much got 17 cents on every dollar. When you watch a UFC event, what you are watching is not just a sport, it is a business model. The octagon is not just where fighters compete. It is where the agreement between a monopoly and the workers who make it valuable is made visible in the most literal possible terms through the willingness of human beings to absorb physical punishment in exchange for whatever the only available employer is willing to pay. The next time Dana White talks about how much he has done for mixed martial arts, about how the sport would be nothing without the platform he built, remember what that platform is built on. Remember the fighter earning $16,000 for a year of preparation and a fractured jaw. Remember the fighter who asked for health insurance and was told to stop talking nonsense. Remember the settlement that changed nothing. Remember that $375 million to the organization that paid it was the cost of a parking ticket compared to the wealth that the challenged practices had generated. The fighters who get in the octagon are remarkable human beings. The system that employs them is not. And now, Dana White wants to do it to boxing, too.